June 5, 1944. The Normandy coast lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, the Atlantic wind carrying salt spray across the bocage country where ancient hedgerows created a labyrinth of shadows. Among the elite reconnaissance teams preparing for the largest amphibious operation in history, one soldier carried a weapon that would have seemed impossibly out of place in this era of mechanized warfare. Corporal Charles Chibiti of the Comanche Nation, attached to the 4th Infantry Division, had spent the previous 3 months in England quietly crafting something that combined ancestral knowledge with modern necessity. He believed his innovation might give his squad a crucial advantage in the silent work ahead. He had no idea his modification would prove so devastatingly effective that it would be classified by military intelligence for 2 decades after the conflict ended. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a personal project born from frustration with standard equipment would transform into one of the most unusual tactical successes of the European campaign, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions remain the most effective even amid the thunder of modern conflict. 3 months earlier, somewhere in southern England, the rain fell in steady sheets across the training grounds where thousands of soldiers prepared for an invasion everyone knew was coming, but no one could discuss. Chibiti sat in the maintenance shed of his temporary base, surrounded by equipment that represented the peak of 1940s military technology. Rifles, grenades, communication devices, all the tools designed to project force across defended beaches. Yet he found himself studying a completely different implement. The compound bow before him was not military issue. He had acquired it through a complex series of trades that began with cigarettes and ended with a sporting goods shipment meant for officers' recreation. Standard military doctrine had no place for such weapons. Firearms had replaced bows on battlefields more than a century ago for obvious reasons, but Chibiti had identified a problem that his superiors either dismissed or failed to fully comprehend. Lieutenant James Morrison entered the shed, shaking water from his helmet. He was a veteran of the North African campaign, a man who had learned to value practical results over procedural orthodoxy. Morrison said, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with that?" Chibiti continued working, his hands moving with practiced precision as he wound thin steel wire around the arrow shaft. "Sir, every reconnaissance manual emphasizes the importance of silent elimination of sentries. The suppressed pistols we have been issued are effective at close range, but they still produce a sound. In the bocage country, with those high hedgerows creating natural sound channels, even a suppressed shot can alert positions 50 yards away." Morrison picked up one of the modified arrows. The shaft was standard wood, but Chibiti had added a series of innovations that transformed it from sporting equipment into something far more lethal. Near the tip, thin strips of rubber cut from inner tubes had been wound tightly, then secured with wire. Behind that, the fletching had been replaced with smaller, stiffer vanes that would stabilize the arrow over shorter distances with less air resistance. The lieutenant examined the tip itself. Chibiti had somehow acquired surgical scalpels and had fastened them to create a 3-bladed broadhead configuration. The edges caught the light with a clarity that spoke to hours of careful sharpening. "You have been working on this for how long?" Morrison asked. 6 weeks, Chibiti replied. "The rubber dampens the vibration when the arrow is released. Standard arrows produce a distinctive whistle in flight. These modifications reduce that sound by approximately 70%. I have tested them at various ranges up to 60 yards. Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering. Their squad had a specific role in the upcoming operation. They would go in with the first wave, tasked with securing the flanks of the beach exits and eliminating observation posts that could direct fire onto the landing zones. Every sentry they could neutralize silently meant fewer soldiers exposed to defensive fire during those crucial first minutes. "Show me," Morrison said simply. They waited until after midnight when the training grounds were empty. Chibiti had set up a series of targets at various distances, using sandbags topped with watermelons to approximate the resistance of the human body. Morrison watched as the Comanche soldier moved through a sequence of shots that demonstrated both the weapon's capability and his own considerable skill. The first arrow struck from 30 yards, the sound of its passage barely audible over the wind. The watermelon split cleanly. The second shot from 45 yards produced the same result. The third, at 60 yards, hit slightly off-center, but still achieved penetration that would have been immediately incapacitating. Morrison said nothing, but he nodded slowly. 2 days later, Chibiti received unofficial authorization to continue his project. He would be permitted to carry the bow as a secondary weapon, provided it did not interfere with his standard equipment or duties. No official record would be made of this addition to their arsenal. The other members of their reconnaissance squad had mixed reactions. Sergeant William Kowalski, a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania, was openly skeptical. He had survived Monte Cassino and trusted only the weapons that had kept him alive through that grinding campaign. Kowalski said, his tone blunt, "You are going to get yourself terminated trying to play frontier scout in the middle of modern combat." Private First Class James Washington, a former college student from Michigan, was more diplomatic, but equally doubtful. He pointed out the practical limitations. Arrows could not be replaced easily in combat. The bow required both hands to operate, leaving the user vulnerable during the draw and release, and no amount of skill could make it effective beyond close quarters. But Private Robert O'Malley, the squad's radio man and a hunter from Montana, understood immediately. He had grown up in country where silence meant the difference between success and failure when stalking game. He recognized what Chibiti was attempting to achieve. O'Malley said, "How many arrows can you carry?" Chibiti had solved that problem with characteristic thoroughness. He had modified a standard ammunition pouch to hold 18 arrows, arranged so they could be drawn quickly, but would not rattle against each other during movement. Each arrow shaft had been marked with paint to indicate range calibration: red for 30 yards, yellow for 45, green for 60. The weeks before the invasion passed with increasing intensity. Training exercises became more specific, more focused on the actual terrain they would encounter. Intelligence briefings provided increasingly detailed information about German defensive positions along the Normandy coast. The reconnaissance squads studied maps until they could navigate the planned approach routes with their eyes closed. Chibiti continued refining his arrows. He discovered that certain types of wood worked better than others for the specific modifications he had developed. He experimented with different adhesives to secure the blades, finding that a combination of mechanical binding and waterproof cement provided the most reliable attachment. He practiced until he could draw, aim, and release in less than 4 seconds. Morrison watched this preparation with growing interest. He began to envision specific scenarios where the bow might prove valuable. The German forces had observation posts throughout the bocage, positions that overlooked the network of sunken lanes connecting the beach exits to the interior. These posts were typically manned by 2 to 4 soldiers equipped with radio equipment. Eliminating them without alerting neighboring positions could be crucial. On June 4th, the invasion was postponed due to weather. The delay created an almost unbearable tension. Thousands of soldiers, fully briefed and psychologically prepared for action, suddenly had to wait with the knowledge that timing might mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Chibiti spent those extra hours in solitude, going through a series of personal rituals. He was not the only Native American soldier in the European theater. Comanche code talkers served with distinction in the Pacific. Cherokee, Navajo, Lakota, and soldiers from dozens of other nations had brought their own traditions into this modern conflict. But Chibiti's approach was unique, blending ancestral practices with contemporary tactical innovation. On the evening of June 5th, as the invasion fleet assembled and began its movement toward Normandy, Morrison gathered his squad for a final briefing. Their objective was a series of observation posts along the cliffs, east of what intelligence designated as Utah Beach. Recent reconnaissance flights had identified at least 5 positions within a 2-mile stretch. Each position potentially controlled fields of fire that could devastate the landing forces. Morrison said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced, "We will land in the 3rd wave. Our timeline requires all 5 positions to be neutralized within 90 minutes of our landing. We cannot use artillery or air support because we need the positions intact for our own use once they are secured." The implication was clear. This would be close quarters work, requiring speed and silence in equal measure. They would be operating in enemy-controlled territory with limited support, moving through unfamiliar terrain against defenders who had spent months preparing their positions. The channel crossing was rough, the landing craft rising and falling in swells that left most soldiers fighting seasickness. Chibiti maintained his focus by methodically checking his equipment. The bow was wrapped in waterproof canvas. The arrows were secured in their modified pouch. His rifle was loaded and ready. His knives were sharpened. Everything was prepared as thoroughly as possible. Dawn was breaking as they approached the beach. The sound of the bombardment was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that seemed to compress the air itself. Shells from the naval vessels screamed overhead, targeting the German defensive positions. Aircraft roared past at low altitude. The whole world seemed to be concentrating its violence on that narrow strip of coastline. Their landing craft hit the beach at 06:45 hours. The ramp dropped, and they poured out into shallow water, moving as fast as the weight of their equipment allowed. The beach was chaos, but their squad had trained for this. They moved through the confusion with purpose, following the predetermined route toward their first objective. The climb up from the beach was harder than the training exercises had suggested. The cliffs were steeper, the footing less secure. Equipment that had felt manageable in England became burdensome under actual combat conditions. But they pushed upward, using ropes and mutual assistance to overcome obstacles. They reached the top to find themselves in the bocage proper. The landscape was a maze of high hedgerows, ancient barriers of earth and vegetation that divided the land into small fields. Visibility was limited to whatever you could see over or through the nearest hedge. Movement was channeled into sunken lanes that could easily become killing zones. Morrison signaled for a halt. According to their maps, the first observation post should be approximately 300 yards to their northeast. They would need to approach carefully, using the hedgerows for concealment while remaining aware that those same hedgerows could hide enemy forces. They moved in standard tactical formation, each soldier covering a field of responsibility. The sounds of combat from the beach were already becoming distant, replaced by the eerie quiet of the bocage interior. Birds sang, leaves rustled in the breeze. It seemed impossible that they were in the middle of the largest military operation in history. Kowalski, on point, raised his fist. Everyone froze. He had spotted movement ahead. Morrison crawled forward to assess the situation. Through a gap in the hedgerow, they could see the observation post. It was exactly as intelligence had described, a reinforced position on high ground, providing clear sight lines toward the beach. But intelligence had underestimated the garrison. Morrison counted 8 soldiers, not the expected 4. 8 men with rifles, machine guns, and radio equipment that could direct fire onto the landing zones. Morrison withdrew and gathered the squad. The original plan had assumed they could neutralize 4 guards with suppressed pistols, moving quickly from one to the next before alarm could be raised. 8 changed the mathematics considerably. He looked at Chibiti and said, "Can you do this?" The Comanche soldier studied the position carefully. The guards were not all visible simultaneously. The layout of the observation post created blind spots. 3 men were clearly visible, manning the observation equipment and radio. 2 more were partially concealed behind defensive barriers. 3 others were out of sight, presumably resting in a dugout shelter that intelligence had not identified. Chibiti said, "I can eliminate the 3 visible guards and possibly the 2 behind the barriers. But once the first arrow strikes, we will have perhaps 15 seconds before the others realize something is wrong. The squad will need to move immediately." Morrison considered. It was not a perfect plan, but perfect plans rarely survived contact with actual conditions. He made his decision. They repositioned to give Chibiti the best possible angle while maintaining cover for the rest of the squad. O'Malley set up his radio, ready to call for support if needed. Washington and Kowalski prepared to rush the position the moment shooting started. Morrison would provide covering fire. Chibiti unwrapped the bow and selected his first arrow. Red marking, 30-yard calibration. The range was actually closer to 35 yards, but he had practiced compensating for such variations. He drew slowly, feeling the familiar resistance of the compound mechanism. The rubber-dampened string made almost no sound as it reached full tension. The first guard was studying the beach through binoculars, completely focused on the developing battle below. He never knew the arrow was coming. It struck with the precision of Chibiti's countless hours of practice, and the guard collapsed without sound. The second guard was adjusting the radio equipment. 4 seconds after the first shot, the second arrow flew. The guard slumped over his equipment, his hand still reaching for a dial he would never adjust. The third visible guard was turning, some instinct warning him that something was wrong. Chibiti's third arrow caught him mid-turn. The guard staggered, tried to cry out, but no sound came. The 2 guards behind the barriers had not yet realized what was happening. Chibiti shifted his aim, compensating for the partial concealment. The 4th arrow struck through a gap in the sandbags. The 5th followed 3 seconds later. Then everything happened at once. One of the guards in the dugout emerged, perhaps hearing the sounds of bodies falling. He saw his companions down, saw Chibiti with the bow, and his mouth opened to shout an alarm. Morrison's suppressed pistol coughed twice. The guard fell back into the dugout. Kowalski and Washington were already moving, covering the distance to the observation post in a rapid sprint. More guards emerged from the shelter, confused and disoriented. The engagement became close-quarters chaos. It was over in less than 30 seconds. 8 guards down, the observation post secured. But Morrison knew they had been fortunate. If even one guard had managed to send a radio message, their entire operation could have been compromised. They quickly disabled the German radio equipment and set up their own. O'Malley called in their success and received coordinates for the second objective. They had 4 more positions to secure before their timeline expired. The pattern repeated through the morning, with variations. The second position had only 3 guards, all eliminated silently with arrows, before they knew they were under attack. The third had 6, requiring a combination of bow work and close combat. The 4th position had 5 guards who were alert and suspicious, forcing the squad into a brief firefight that Morrison worried might compromise their mission. But it was the 5th position that would become the focus of classified reports for years afterward. Intelligence had described it as a minor observation post, probably manned by 3 or 4 soldiers. As the squad approached through the bocage, they discovered that intelligence had been dramatically wrong. The position was much larger than expected, with at least 15 soldiers visible, and probably more in underground shelters. It was not just an observation post, but a coordination center for an entire section of the defensive network. Taking it by direct assault would be costly and would certainly alert every German position for miles around. Morrison called a halt while they considered their options. They were already behind schedule. The original 90-minute timeline had stretched to nearly 3 hours, but rushing into a fortified position against superior numbers would be suicidal. Chibiti studied the layout carefully. The position was well designed, with overlapping fields of fire and clear approaches that would expose any attacking force. But the designers had made one critical error. They had assumed attacks would come from the direction of the beach. The position's rear was less heavily defended, protected mainly by the assumption that no enemy force could approach from the interior. He outlined his idea to Morrison. It was audacious, perhaps even reckless, but it might work. They would split the squad. Morrison, Kowalski, and Washington would create a diversion on the beach-facing side of the position, making enough noise to suggest a larger force. Meanwhile, Chibiti and O'Malley would circle around to the rear approach. Chibiti would use the bow to eliminate sentries and any guards who responded to investigate the diversion. Once enough confusion was created, Morrison would lead the main assault. Morrison asked, "How many arrows do you have left?" Chibiti counted. 13 plus those I can recover if time permits. It was not much margin for error, but they had no better options. Morrison made the decision to proceed. The diversion began 15 minutes later. Morrison's group opened fire from concealed positions, creating the impression of a larger force probing the defenses. The German response was immediate and professional. Soldiers moved to defensive positions, machine guns traversed to cover likely approaches, and a runner was dispatched to call for reinforcements. That runner was Chibiti's first target from the rear approach. The arrow took him down silently before he had covered 20 yards. The second target was a sentry who had turned to watch the excitement on the front side of the position. never thinking to check his rear. The third was a radio operator who had stepped outside his bunker for a better view. O'Malley, watching through binoculars, whispered a running count. 3 down, 4-5. The Germans were still focused on Morrison's diversion, not realizing they were being systematically reduced from behind. Chibiti moved with the patience his grandfather had taught him during childhood hunts in Oklahoma. Rush and you fail, panic, and you die. Each shot was carefully considered, each target selected to create maximum confusion with minimum alarm. When guards fell, their companions assumed they had taken cover from Morrison's firing. The truth never occurred to them. 6 down, 7, 8. The mathematics of the engagement were shifting. What had begun as a fortified position with a 3-to-1 advantage was becoming something more balanced. Then a German officer emerged from the command bunker, took one look at the situation and immediately understood. He shouted orders, trying to rally his forces to face the actual threat. Chibiti's next arrow took him down, but the warning had been given. The German defenders began turning to meet the rear assault just as Morrison launched his main attack from the front. The position was caught between two forces, its defenses optimized for neither threat. The fight was intense but brief. Chibiti dropped his bow and transitioned to his rifle, joining the close-quarters battle that decided the engagement. When silence finally returned, 14 German soldiers lay defeated across the position. The 15th, a young private who looked barely 18, had surrendered immediately when he found himself facing 3 rifles at close range. Morrison's squad had achieved their objective. All 5 observation posts were secured. The approaches to Utah Beach were now under Allied control. The cost had been miraculously light. One of Washington's squad members had taken a minor wound, and Kowalski had wrenched his ankle during the final assault. But it was Chibiti's performance that dominated Morrison's after-action report. The lieutenant documented 23 confirmed eliminations by bow, each achieved with a silence and precision that exceeded any alternative method. He recommended immediate classification of the technique and further investigation into whether similar approaches could be employed elsewhere. The military intelligence response was swift and surprising. Within a week, Chibiti was pulled from his unit and sent to England for debriefing. Officers from multiple branches wanted to understand his methods. Engineers wanted to examine his modifications. Training specialists wanted to know if his skills could be taught to other soldiers. Chibiti cooperated fully, demonstrating his techniques and explaining his reasoning. But he also made clear that what he had achieved was not purely technical. The bow was simply a tool. The effectiveness came from patience, judgment, and a willingness to move at nature's pace, rather than demanding immediate results from overwhelming force. One intelligence officer, a major named Richardson, seemed particularly interested. He asked question after question about the psychological aspects. How did Chibiti maintain composure while operating alone in enemy territory? How did he decide which targets to engage and which to avoid? How did he manage the stress of close-quarters work where a single mistake could be fatal? Chibiti's answers were honest, but not particularly satisfying to men trained in conventional military doctrine. He spoke of hunting deer in Oklahoma as a child, of learning to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder moving through it. He explained that silence was not merely the absence of sound, but a kind of harmonious movement that did not disturb the natural rhythms around you. Richardson listened carefully, took extensive notes, and then classified everything Chibiti had said at the highest level. The major explained that the implications went beyond immediate military application. The Cold War was already visible on the horizon, and the methods Chibiti had demonstrated might prove valuable in that very different kind of conflict. For 2 decades, the full details remained buried in classified files. Official histories of the Normandy invasion mentioned reconnaissance operations and the securing of observation posts, but provided no specifics about methods or personnel. Chibiti returned to his unit, continued to serve with distinction through the remainder of the European campaign, and returned home to Oklahoma when the conflict ended. He rarely spoke of his experiences, and when he did, he focused on his brothers in arms rather than his personal achievements. The classified status was finally lifted in 1965, though by then the world had changed so dramatically that few people paid attention. A researcher working on a comprehensive history of Native American military service stumbled across the reports and recognized their significance. He interviewed Chibiti, who was by then in his early 50s and working as a teacher on a reservation in Oklahoma. The interview revealed additional details that the military reports had not captured. Chibiti explained that his innovation had not been motivated primarily by tactical advantage, but by a deeper concern. He had watched too many young soldiers die because the technology they carried made them visible and audible to enemies who could harm them before they knew they were in danger. He had wanted to give his squad members a better chance of survival by providing options that worked with the environment rather than announcing their presence to everyone within earshot. He also revealed that the psychological impact of his methods had been more significant than he had initially realized. German prisoners captured from positions adjacent to those his squad had secured reported a profound demoralization. They described comrades who simply fell without warning, without sound, without any indication of where the threat might be. Some had attributed it to snipers, but the angles were wrong. Others speculated about new secret weapons. The truth, when it eventually became known, had been even more unsettling. They had been defeated by what they considered a primitive weapon wielded with exceptional skill. The researcher asked why Chibiti thought the military had classified his methods for so long. The Comanche veteran considered the question carefully before answering. He said, "I think they realized that what I had demonstrated was not really about bows and arrows. It was about approaching problems differently. The military is a large organization that works best when everyone follows standard procedures. What I did worked because it was unique, unexpected, not part of anyone's defensive planning. If it had become standard procedure, it would have lost that advantage. Enemies would have adapted their defenses. It only worked because it was one person, in one place, doing something no one expected." This insight pointed to a broader truth about innovation in military affairs. The most effective tactics are often those that opponents cannot anticipate because they fall outside conventional thinking. But once employed, once recognized and adopted as doctrine, they become part of the expected and lose much of their power. Chibiti's success was inseparable from its uniqueness. The arrows themselves became minor artifacts of military history. Several were recovered from the battlefield by soldiers who recognized their unusual nature. One ended up in a museum in Oklahoma, displayed alongside other Native American military memorabilia. The museum card identifies it simply as a modified hunting arrow carried during the Normandy invasion, with no mention of its combat use. Chibiti's bow was returned to him after the conflict. He kept it for many years, occasionally using it for hunting, but never discussing its history. When he passed away in 1987, his family donated it to a tribal museum where it remains on display. Visitors often pass it without particular interest, not realizing the story it represents. Morrison, the lieutenant who had authorized Chibiti's unconventional approach, went on to have a distinguished military career. He became a colonel, served in Korea, and eventually worked in tactical doctrine development. In that capacity, he occasionally tried to resurrect interest in unconventional methods that leveraged individual skill rather than standardized equipment. His efforts had limited success. The military's institutional momentum favored approaches that could be mass-produced and widely distributed rather than those requiring exceptional individual ability. But Morrison never forgot the lesson of that June morning in Normandy. In his personal papers, donated to a military archive after his death, researchers found a note he had written to himself. "The best weapon is not necessarily the most advanced. The best weapon is the one that accomplishes the mission with the resources available, used by a soldier who understands both the tool and the task." We forget this at our peril. The other members of that reconnaissance squad went on to diverse post-conflict lives. Kowalski returned to Pennsylvania and worked in the coal mines until automation made his job obsolete, then retrained as a mine safety inspector. Washington used his military benefits to complete college and became a teacher in Detroit. O'Malley returned to Montana and spent 30 years as a forest ranger, work that suited his temperament and utilized skills developed during the conflict. They maintained contact through the years, gathering occasionally for reunions where they would share memories and marvel at their survival. Chibiti attended these gatherings when he could, though the distance from Oklahoma made it difficult. When he did come, The others treated him with a respect that went beyond wartime camaraderie. They had seen what he accomplished, understood the courage it required to operate as he had, alone and exposed, trusting in skill and judgment rather than firepower. The historical significance of Cibiti's innovation extends beyond the immediate tactical success. It demonstrated that even in an era of mechanized warfare, there remained space for approaches that drew on pre-industrial knowledge and skills. The conflict's general narrative emphasized technology, production capacity, and material superiority. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, the tools of modern industrial states. But victories ultimately depended on individual soldiers making crucial decisions in specific moments, and those decisions were shaped by everything those soldiers brought to the task, including knowledge that had nothing to do with military training manuals. Native American soldiers served throughout the conflict with distinction, bringing diverse skills and perspectives to a military that was only beginning to recognize the value of that diversity. Code talkers are now well known, their contribution to secure communications widely celebrated, but many other contributions remain less recognized. Soldiers who could move silently through difficult terrain. Soldiers who could read landscape and weather with skills developed through generations. Soldiers who understood that patience and timing could be as valuable as speed and violence. Cibiti's story represents thousands of similar stories, small innovations and adaptations that collectively made the difference between success and failure in countless engagements. The official histories focus on generals and grand strategy, on divisions and armies moving across maps. But the reality of conflict occurs at the level of individual soldiers, confronting specific problems with whatever resources and creativity they can muster. The modification of those 18 arrows, the patient practice to achieve reliable accuracy, the courage to approach defended positions with a weapon. Most of his contemporaries would have considered obsolete. All of this exemplified a kind of military excellence that transcends technology. It was excellence born from cultural heritage, personal dedication, and a willingness to think beyond standard solutions. In the decades since, military historians have occasionally referenced Cibiti's achievement when discussing unconventional warfare methods. Special operations forces have studied his approach as an example of how individual initiative can create disproportionate impact. Some training programs now include segments on historical examples of tactical innovation, and Cibiti's story features prominently. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler and more personal. It lies in the fact that 23 soldiers who might have alerted their commanders and inflicted casualties on Allied forces were instead silently removed from the battle, giving soldiers on the beaches below a slightly better chance of survival. How many lives were saved by that improved chance? The mathematics are impossible to calculate with precision, but the impact was real. Cibiti never claimed to be a hero. When asked about his actions, he emphasized the collective effort of his squad and the broader operation. He pointed out that his contribution was small, compared to the thousands of soldiers who faced direct fire on the beaches, the pilots who flew through defensive fire, the sailors who brought the invasion force across the channel. His perspective was accurate in one sense. What he accomplished was indeed a small part of an enormous military operation, but it was also profound. In choosing to develop a skill that others dismissed, in dedicating himself to excellence with a tool that seemed anachronistic, in approaching problems from a perspective shaped by cultural heritage rather than standard military doctrine, he demonstrated possibilities that the institution around him had not considered. His success was not just about eliminating sentries, it was about proving that there are always more ways to solve a problem than the obvious methods suggest. The young soldiers who study military history today encounter Cibiti's story in various forms, usually as a footnote or sidebar to larger narratives about the Normandy invasion. Most will read it with interest and move on to other topics, but some will pause and consider the deeper implications. They will recognize that effectiveness in conflict, as in life, comes from understanding your strengths, developing them with dedication, and applying them with wisdom rather than trying to be something you are not. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.